Works in Progress series, and also Philosophy of Struggle, and also main Locke Society discussion. I want to welcome three guest speakers, Serequeberhan from Morgan State University, also thinking president and a number of other books on Harvard and African philosophy. Professor Rozena Maart from the University of Purdue, head of the Purdue Center for Critical Research and Race and Identity for critical race studies. And she also manages a series of lectures on philosophy of the struggle, philosophy of masters in Durban, South Africa. Hopefully some of these students will be able to attend some programs that she has there. The Black Thought Collective, hopefully you'll be able to connect with her to exchange with students at the University of Purdue. We have a thought collective here as well. And Professor Corey Barnes, a resident Alain Locke scholar from the University of San Diego, posted reading material on Locke. He's working on Locke's conception of value theory. And I want to thank my class. I have two classes here. One is in a critical theory class, and another is philosophy and African culture. And I have some students who've been working on various parts of this material. Jonathan and Rivers, for example, have been working on Locke. Students have been working on Curry, Martin, and Daniels, and Gowell. Curry. So various students have been working on different issues in their class, and they've been very courageous and willing to talk to instructors that we've had in the class. We've had instructors from various parts of the world to Skype into our class and listen to their book reviews and dialogue. So I want to thank my class for being courageous for doing that. They don't have to, they're all volunteer. Without further yes, she does wonderful work on Locke and Black Consciousness, and is also part of the Black Thought Collective. And I hope if you have some time afterwards, have some time to introduce yourselves to our guests. So I want to thank you for coming again. And the Talking and Testifying idea is to present what people are working on now, their major projects, and their major ideas, what they're up to these days. We're very fortunate to have them here. The exact idea of talking is to engage in that kind of dialogue and discussion, push the debate, and agree and disagree, and come to an conclusion. So, without much further ado, I'll ask our guests to begin to take over. Let's see which we have. Go first.
So do you want us to sit so we're facing?
Yeah. There's another one of our Locke scholars who's doing work on Locke in the Negro. Corey Barnes is a visiting Locke scholar. The idea is to meet all the people who will work on the things that you're working on. And then they can dialogue and discussion. That's not an easy thing to always do. Sometimes you feel a little pressure. That's okay. This is supposed to be a philosophy class, and whatever thing you have, it's all. Okay. Without further ado, I've been honored to meet Professor Rozena Maart, and honored to do the situation in the house. Okay. So I guess we should go from one end to the other. Is that okay?
I'm fine.
Okay.
Either way. All right. So I'm not sure how much South African history you know, and it's always hard to kind of jump in when I'm in the US because I'm very aware that people don't always know where South Africa is. Do you all know where South Africa is on the map? Yes? Yes? Not sure? Yes? Okay, so shall I do a quick map here? I'm not very good at drawing, by the way. So I'll just quickly. It's a good way to talk about some of what I'm doing right now. Something like that. Yeah? So South Africa is, that's Namibia, so somewhere like that. Yeah? And Cape Town, where I'm from, I did a bad job of There you go. There, okay.
That's a big difference tonight. Yeah, big difference. Yeah, I would have never thought.
It's important. So this is Cape Town, also known as Kaapstad, for people who read Dutch and German. And this is Durban, which is where I live now. Yes? And I'm very bad at drawing, so I'm not even going to try to draw Madagascar. I'm just going to give you an idea of where it is. Madagascar, so you would have Java as part of Indonesia, and this over here. And of course you would have St. Helena over here, which is where Napoleon was banished. You know that island? Yes? Okay. And quickly I'll just tell you so that you have an understanding of why I do the work that I do. So you all know that my last name is Maart. Yes? Which is March in English. So this is in Dutch. You say January, February, March, April, May, Juni. Yes? In English, you say January, February, March, April, May, whatever. So my grandfather, his surname is Maart, and he's from the Xhosa, which is from the Eastern Cape here, this region. And my grandmother her heritage is Javanese Hindu from her ancestry. And my cousins are April. So what this means is it's just a kind of note so that you know this has to do with Dutch timing and colonization. So the time of your month of your enslavement became your surname. Wow. So just a little bit of kind of history. So what I do, I'll sort of take you through some of the research projects that I'm doing. So I also write fiction. I've got 20 minutes, or we can go. Okay, I also write fiction, and one of the reasons I write fiction, I suppose, is I'm from a community which was called District 6. And please don't talk about the District 9 film, because I'll probably be ill if you do. So District 6 in 1867 got its name as this part here, as the 6th municipality of the Cape. So it was home to the first, it's the oldest enslaved community at the Cape. And in 1973, I was 11 and a half. And before I was born, from 1960 onwards, where you had the Group Areas Act in place, they introduced a Forced Removal Act because black people and many enslaved communities, also places like Sophia Town, Harfield Village, District 6, people refused to move because the government decided that they wanted to make certain parts of the city white. And so we were forcibly removed, in 1973 on the 4th of August, and one of the things that happened was I got hives every year. Where's Melanie? Yeah. Okay, because that's part of the paper. On that day, and my grandmother would take me to the community clinic, and of course there would be no evidence of the fact that I had hives. So this happened for many years until I was, I think 28. So I know it's something like I had it for 16 years, so on the same day. And of course, like in many black and enslaved communities, you grow up with a sense of seeing things around you. And I don't want to use the word normal, and sort of seeing it as something as part of either black bodily outrage, or it's what Frantz Fanon encounters when he has to give a definition and a classification or diagnosis of schizophrenia. It's why we have our revolutionaries like Serequeberhan, Frantz Fanon, Steve Biko, trained as medical doctors, because they understood the relationship between lived experience and, in other words, what we call the materiality of race, right? The conditions under which you live, right? Are you with me? Yes? Yes. Okay, so my grandfather, basically I discovered when I was 16 only that he was Xhosa because he spoke English, Afrikaans, sorry, because his timing was Dutch timing. So my mother's mother and father spoke in Afrikaans. It was Old Dutch, because the Afrikaners reclaimed themselves in the early 1900s as Afrikaners, meaning they claim to the land. So I'm just going to jump a little bit. So I began to be interested in the relationship between the body and the mind, because I found out that not only was my grandfather's, both his legs were amputated. One was the year after our forced removal, and then the other one the following year. But when I was in my 20s, I discovered that this had happened many different ways in which people are affected mentally, had affected many of my friends in our community. So fiction was my first kind of route to talk about what I call the hidden, the forbidden, and the repressed. It's sort of my definition of deconstruction in some way, the kind of revelation of how the subject experiences their materiality, the conditions under which they are racialized. Hello. Hi. Hi. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Yeah. And so my response at first was, because my mother had basically taught us never to talk about District 6, as it would give my grandparents a sense of failure, that they hadn't fought hard enough. This became a recurring theme in my work, because sometimes you have friends, you don't like them but you love them, or you love them but you don't like them. And they tell you things like, for God's sake, Rozena, you do psychoanalysis. Surely you must know what these hives are about. So I got hives every single day, every single year on that day. And that was my entry into fiction, was to write about what I was forbidden to say, yeah, within my house and whatever. It's also, for some folks, a very kind of, I mean, I've been asked questions like, why aren't there white people in the story? Well, why should there be? Why should there be? I mean, first of all, District 6 was that enslaved community, and we didn't see white folks in that community. So I think there's this kind of, I don't want to say obsession, that's too complex. I think there's almost a need that you see, Westerners expect to see the white oppressor in the narratives of black people. Well, first of all, I don't want them there. I didn't grow up with white folks there. And secondly, I get a lot of questions as to why is it a story about two older women making love in a bath? Well, I mean, I'm not going to apologize for sex and sexuality, and I'm not going to apologize for the fact that there's an expectation of that if people are oppressed, all we do is spend our time being oppressed. We have no sense of love, desire, pleasure, eroticism, or anything like that. So that was my first entry into grappling with my identity, my sense of coming out of an environment where I was forbidden to say and speak those kinds of things. So at the moment, so I'm jumping a little bit, I'm finishing a novel called The Slave Girls. And one of the things that's happened in South Africa in the last 20 years is, so we had something called, I'll write it in Afrikaans and in English, called the dopstelsel, which is called the tot system. Anybody know? Do you know what this is? It's where enslaved people who worked on the farms in Stellenbosch, Franschhoek, that whole region, were not paid in cash, they were paid in alcohol. Yeah? So this was only outlawed after 94. It had been going on all the time. And there are farms like the one called Soames Delta, where Mark Soames is a medical doctor and a psychiatrist owns it. And when he bought it over, because he lived in the UK, he wanted to do an extension to have a garage, and then discovered through one of the construction people that there was something not quite right. He then brought in a team of people and discovered that he's basically sitting on 400 years of or more of civilization. So many farmers now, by going through their history, obviously, have you seen what white Afrikaners look like in South Africa? They certainly don't look like folks from Amsterdam or Holland. So basically, some of the farmers had looked into their history and realized that their ancestral history are very connected to the enslaved communities and have given workers shares in the farm. And I also, by looking at different archival material, came upon histories of women who were moved from one farm to another as enslaved women because those families were afraid that their sons would be sexually attracted to these women. And so my story at the moment that I'm writing on The Slave Girls is a fictional account of a woman who has 5 children. One is born out of love, and the others are born out of blackmail and rape. Because I didn't want to write a story where this constant narrative of black women being raped becomes the narrative of how the enslaved woman emerges into literature, into the imagination. I think it would be erroneous to continue this depiction as though black women, or women in general, have no agency. We're just there to say yes or no to sex. We don't initiate, we don't, assert ourselves. And so I wanted to make sure that I write something that is fictional, that gives an account of some of the events. So that's one thing I work on. And I've interviewed lots of women and men from the farms to talk about their experience. Another project I work on is called Critical Times, Critical Race. And we basically have had lots of situations in South Africa. I'll tell you very briefly, I'm watching my time. Some of which include, for example, last year I went into the store called Woolworths. I don't know what the equivalent would be in the US, but it's kind of, I would say, a department store where your clothes and accessories are downstairs and then you have food. But it's definitely not, it would be considered like a middle class department store. And I walked in and there was an older white man walking in front of me. And as this young black woman came and did her cash, he just knocked her out of the way. So I had a big confrontation with him. Despite my high heels and lipstick, he shouted and I shouted louder. So we were having this thing. I called the police, I called the press. 12 of the women came forward that day, who were then sent to go to lunch, to say that he'd done similar things to them. He had stabbed them with his keys. He had done all kinds of things. The management knew him, they knew his name, and they'd done nothing. So I forced them to take him to court. And this is just one small incident, small in the sense of there are many like that in South Africa. So we have students who undergo training for how to ask questions, how to do research, how to do data analysis, data capturing, how to do interviews. So this is a 3-year project. We do what we call in South Africa capacity development, but it's also to look at incidents where racism is still rife. We had a state agent 2 years ago write about black people as monkeys on the beaches. Why are they there? It's packed, you know. So notions of race and space. We also have a project called Race, Space in the City. So notions of, you know, the beach still as a white space. I mean, guess who was the first person to make tanning in the news? Coco Chanel. When she was on a boat, she got off, I think it was in the 1930s, you know. I mean, forget about the Nazi period in Europe, as though that didn't exist, but she got off the boat, and there were these photographers saying, oh, she looks sun-kissed. Black people are never told, or people of color are never told you look sun-kissed, right? We're either dark or olive, or that's the best you can get. And so tanning became popular for white folks as an indication of their wealth. The beach is there for leisure, for pleasure. So you don't work, you lie in the sun like roast pork or whatever you eat, whatever, I don't know. But you know, this kind of thing. And so there's a lot of anger on the side of white South Africans that there's so many black people on the beaches, and Christmas, New Year, so this has been a big thing. Then we've had women write on Facebook and then retract, say, no, I want to withdraw my statement. So the ANC has taken some of these people to court, to Human Rights Commission. So you have a lot of this in South Africa, and part of what the project does is also keep track of racist events and writing about it. In 2016, on the 1st of February, a young black man had sexually assaulted, was a racist attack and a sexual attack. His mother's white, his father's black. They sent him to a traditional Afrikaner agricultural school. Who goes to agricultural colleges, Afrikaners in South Africa, so that they can learn to take care of the farm? So this young man, first day at the school, these 5 boys, young men get together, so they're all between the ages of 14 and 18. They get a white soapy substance, they smear it all over him, because you can't touch a black person, you have to make them white first. And then they sexually assault him with a broom. And videotape it. And of course, needless to say, we don't know how we can connect death, trauma to leukemia. He was diagnosed 6 months after that. He stopped going to school, traumatized, and he died a year later from leukemia. So this is one study, and there are many like that in South Africa. So that's one thing that we do. And then we also have a project which, thanks to Professor Harris's work on philosophy born of struggle, I work with a very intense and very interesting group of students around philosophy born of massacres. And I was telling Corey last night that often we have students from the US or other places who are studying violent attacks and phobia or Holocaust studies, and we had put a notice that, you know, like Wednesday from 12 till 2, there'll be a seminar centered around Holocaust studies. And lo and behold, you get people from the States who come and they sit down and they want to take notes, you know. And they were absolutely shocked when our reference point was Namibia. I mean, I had to explain where it was, you know, right over here, you know, was, and that this Holocaust took place between 1902 and 1907, mainly 1903, but they started in 1902, because the Second Reich wanted to have a place to test how they could kill as many black people as possible and have a nice little, big, spacious homeland for the German population. So one of the things that this does is also draw awareness in the larger part of what we do, which is called African scholarship in South Africa. This is what we do. And also to draw attention to the fact that many incidents, like the one you heard about at Marikana, which was August of 2012, just go completely under the radar internationally. Same as what happened in Rwanda. Rwanda, there's a different approach because here the West can say, oh, it's just black people killing one another, it's just Africans killing one another. So the focus of the work that I do, and with various groups of students on our campus, we also take the projects to other cities. We also take the projects to rural cities. We also work with 14 schools on a gender-based violence project and a Steve Biko project, because I don't know in the US if you have something called life orientation, where high school students learn life orientation. And what we discovered was that when the teachers came in, was that they do one lecture on Steve Biko, where they basically say, this is where he was born, and this is when he died. So we now have, it's not an official module, but we have sort of a template that we've generated with teachers to provide a much clearer, much more in-depth understanding of who Steve Biko was. And the same when it comes to gender-based violence, because it's one of those things, again, that can completely go undetected, and also it has to be linked to the Constitution, to the way in which young people learn about their rights. So I think I should stop here, and I think if there are questions that you may have during the time, I can give you a little bit more details about philosophy born of massacres, critical times, critical race, race, space, and the city, which also includes work on xenophobia. So I'm going to leave it over to my colleagues here. Thank you.
I think we can take questions now or afterwards, briefly afterwards. Okay. Sorry?
All right, hey, folks, can I get this?
I'm good.
Right, all right, so my name is Corey Barnes. I teach philosophy at the University of San Diego. To make following what I do a little bit easier, I created a little taxonomy, all right, of the metaphysics of race.
It's not connected.
No.
You have to log in the order.
Yeah, I need to log on. All right, so I guess I'll start backwards. All right, I do work on social political philosophy, namely around the issue of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is the idea that we have certain political and moral obligations that extend beyond national borders. All right, my interest in that is for sort of to construct a community whereby we have peace. All right, which is the end goal of Immanuel Kant's toward perpetual peace. I engage that through Alain Locke. All right, so Dr. Leonard Harris here is the person who introduced me to Alain Locke when I was at Howard University. I had known Alain Locke, the Harlem Renaissance critic. I had not known Alain Locke, the philosopher. So Alain Locke actually gets his PhD in philosophy from Harvard. All right. It wasn't until Leonard Harris came and did a guest lecture in an African American philosophy class that I actually knew anything about it. So what I try to do is I try to work out Alain Locke's theory in a more systematic way than I think it has been done yet. That's not good. Yeah. Let me pull this up first. We'll get to that in a second. All right, this is just a taxonomy that I've created to kind of make my explanation of what I do a little bit easier. But we're not interested in this part yet. All right, so my interest in Alain Locke, like I said, is I try to systematize his philosophy. I think that undergirds a lot of his philosophy, his value theory, his philosophy of art.
Sorry, I was just dimming that so we can see.
Okay. All right. I think what undergirds a lot of Alain Locke's philosophy, his value theory, his philosophy of art, even his philosophy of education, is an underlying commitment to cosmopolitanism. So the goal of the manuscript that I'm putting together is to work out Alain Locke's complete system of philosophy in more of a systematic way. All right, I want to show how his philosophy of art relates to his democratic theory, that relates to his philosophy of education, that relates to his value theory. I'm not as clear on Alain Locke's philosophy of religion and where that fits. So that's sort of the holdup on the manuscript. I find myself in the project attempting to defend Alain Locke's position a little bit. I think there's a lot in Alain Locke around the idea of pluralism, around the idea that cosmopolitanism can't come at the expense of a plurality of different religions, different people, different identities. So I find a lot that he has to offer. All right, so that's part one of what I'm doing now. Another part that I'm doing is I work on democratic theory, and I'm attempting to work out sort of a notion of respect that is fundamental in order for a functioning democracy to exist. All right, so what must respect look like? All right, I'm also using Alain Locke for that. I can't really talk a whole lot about that because I'm not really satisfied with my thinking. But I'm trying to use Alain Locke. I use Alain Locke and Stephen Darwall. Stephen Darwall gives us two types of respect: recognition respect and appraisal respect. And I'm trying to interlace Alain Locke and Stephen Darwall. All right. Second, so that's my Alain Locke connection. All right. I'm working on a book that seeks to systematize Alain Locke's philosophy in a way that I have not seen done yet, and then I'm trying to work out sort of a form of respect required in order to have a functioning democracy. All right, the second part of my research regards the philosophy of race. All right, and when I look at philosophy of race, I look at two things. One, the language of race. All right, so when we use race and race terms, all right, are we talking about the same thing? So when I say that you are white, I'm assuming I'm right. All right, what did I just say? Right? I just said you have certain traits, you are socially constructed, X, Y, and Z, right? So what am I talking about? And when you say that I'm black, what are you talking about? Right? When we use race and we use race terms, what is it that we mean? All right, can we come up with an understanding or a concept of race that we all agree on? All right? I'm not sure where I stand on that, but that's sort of the language of race. The other part of race that I look at is the metaphysics of race. All right, so when I look at the metaphysics of race, I don't know that this is, every time I talk to Jacoby Carter, I feel like this is not right again. All right, but this is sort of when I say metaphysical or ontological, what I mean is the being of race, what race is. All right, so when we say race, do we mean something biological? Do we mean something social? Do we mean something like an illusion? Do we mean something biological but not biologically fit? All right, so here we have four metaphysical positions, and then three, the parts in blue are three normative positions about race. I'll explain in a second. So we have racial naturalism. Racial naturalism just has the idea that races exist in a biological way and that there are bio-behavioral essences to those races. So we've all heard of Immanuel Kant. Yes? All right, so Immanuel Kant has this idea of races that derive from the unfolding of certain germs given sort of air and sun, And air and sun produce in us sort of a proclivity to certain moral behavior. It also produces in us sort of intellectual differences that he talks about. That would be sort of a thick naturalism, all right, racial naturalism. Then there's racial constructionism. Racial constructionism is just going to purport the falsity of race in a biological sense, but suggests that race in a social sense is real. All right? So even if biological races is false, races have come into existence and continue to exist through human culture and decisions. All right? Race is sociologically real. All right? And the social reality of race is enough to make it real. All right? So we're not talking about something false. We would talk about something like a correlate could be like professors, right? Professors are social constructions, but they are real social constructions. All right, then there's racial skepticism. Racial skepticism just says, because racial naturalism is false, races of any kind do not exist. In order for races to exist, they must refer to something in the natural world. It's supposed to be world, my God. Since they don't, then they do not exist. All right, so racial skeptics, like social constructionists, would deny the reality of race, but would say that the social construction of race does not make it real. All right, race is a sort of a social illusion. All right, and then you have racial population naturalism, which is a thinner type of naturalism. All right, so although racial naturalism falsely attributes cultural, mental, and physical properties to discrete racial groups, it is possible that genetically significant biological groups exist that merit the term race. All right, so we can look at something like gene clusters. All right, is it the case that certain people with certain phenotypes have certain genes in common that would merit the term race, even though they don't, even though we can't attribute like biobehavioral differences between them? All right, so at the risk of pissing Dr. Harris off, all right, I'm going to tell you the way that I'm working out race. All right, so what I will grant the social construction or the social constructivism of race. I'll grant it. All right, I'll grant it. All right, race was created. It came about in history. And it came about in history to rank order people in a particular way, or at least it has the effect of rank ordering particular people in a particular way. And that rank ordering has produced certain results in society. The question, not that I backed off of my claim from like a year ago. All right, so a year ago I made a very stronger claim that we can infer that races exist in a biological manner, even if we grant social constructionism its reality. So we say that races begin as social constructs. Do we have grounds to purport the naturalness of race? All right, I leave it as an open question at the end of this project that's about to be published. So I say, look, I'll grant everything that the racial constructivist wants. All right, race has a beginning in society. Its beginning in society rank ordered people in a particular way and treats people accordingly in society. All right, can we suggest or can we infer that races exist in a biological manner from that treatment? All right, I look at sort of a biological or a cross between sort of biology and medicine called epigenesis. Anybody know what epigenesis is? What is it?
I've already heard the term epigenetics before, and it's this kind of marriage, like the kind of age-old nature versus nurture question is kind of thrown out and said nature and like the environment and kind of how you're brought up. It's really a mixture.
Good.
They
So the big claim of epigenesis is that you don't have sort of genetic alterations. All right, your DNA is your DNA, but genes express themselves in a number of ways, given responses or as responses to certain environmental stresses. All right, so you might get the expression of a gene such that it produces a phenotype, even though the gene itself has not changed. All right, so we're not talking about genetic alterations like Deadpool. If you stress the body hard enough, you'll get like this genetic like beast, right? We're not talking about that. All right, but I ask, well, look, if we take social constructionism, or if we take racial constructionist arguments seriously about races categorizing people and treating different people in certain ways, and it's also true that epigenesis is true, can we derive a biologically real notion of race? All right, because of the types of environmental stresses that categorizing people and treating people in accordance with those categories derive or produce or could produce. All right, I leave it as an open question, but just something. Did I see your hand? I'll take the question.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I was just, when you say biological, what is the root definition of biological to begin with? Because what I'm hearing you say is that, I mean, it's like what came first, the chicken or the egg? What came first, the gene, the DNA, right? The gene piece, or the definition of what it means to be race biological?
No. So I'm taking it that there was a time in history where there weren't these things called races. I'm taking it that history has produced these things called races purely in a sociological manner. All right. I'm taking it that in history we find people being categorized in a certain way and treated in a certain way generation after generation because of this thing that we've socially constructed. All right. If the body or the organism responds to social stresses, and social stresses are stable generation after generation, there might be cause to infer or there might be reason to infer epigenetic similarities across different groups of people socialized in particular ways.
But would we have to would not we have to have some kind of documentation of the psyche? Let's say, let's take black folks.
No. So I'm not inferring psychological differences.
Okay.
I'm inferring
Genetic.
phenotypic differences.
Okay.
All right. So what we're talking about are phenotype expressions, right? Now, if you're a reductionist, then you would have to say something like psychological properties derived from physical, like makeup, right? But I'm not going there. So the account is not something like a racial naturalist account. It's a racial populations naturalist, right? Where you have certain phenotypes that are the responses of treatment or stresses in an environment, right? So that's the problem. And again, I leave it as an open question. Only I don't use this, so let me talk about the blue. All right, we can talk about normative conservationism, which just says that races and race talk ought to be conserved either for practical purposes or because there's some inherent goodness to like race and race terms, something like the preservation of culture or something like that. We can talk about normative eliminativism, which recommends discarding the concept entirely. And then we can talk about normative reconstructivism, which recommends that we replace racial discourse or race terms with something that would allow us to have some of the benefits, some of these pragmatic benefits, but don't promote something like epistemic falsities. All right, so you don't have to talk in terms of race. You can talk in terms. Josh Glasgow tells us race star, something like that. Race star is just a placeholder. It's like X. All right, so we can invent a term that does some of the work of race. All right, so I talk in this term. So I use sort of this racial populations account to support, contrary to what a lot of people tend to support a normative eliminativist account. All right, so here's a line we cross that with. All right, because what I want to say is that, well, when we look at epigenetic effects, right, when we look at the stresses both for black people and white people, however we're going to define that, after we do the research, all right, it's probably the case that the epigenetic responses have not been good for any group, all right? At least that's what the literature seems to support, all right? And what I recommend is that we need to eliminate race in order to eliminate some of the negative epigenetic effects, all right? That it seems to be the case that is that can be attributed to both. All right. So we agree in the end. All right. There you go. There you go. I feared this talk. All right. I was just going to talk about Locke, and then I was going to talk about the econ stuff, and I was just going to leave it alone. But I said, well, since we agree in the end, I think I can do this, and I won't get like ran out the campus. Right. So that's the race project. I'm out of time. So, last thing, really fast, is you are going to disagree with this. All right. I think, given our conversation at lunch, I think I'm going to write sort of a philosophical piece on hip hop. All right. A piece that appraises and defends, in some sense, the value of hip hop. Dr. Harris hates hip hop. How do you hate hip hop?
Yeah, how could you?
How could you? You see that look? You see that's an uncanny look? No. But I think I do.
Yeah, talk.
I think I do want to sort of, because we treat, or there's a tendency, not that you're doing, but there's a tendency to treat hip hop as though hip hop is just this musical art form, or this art form devoid of like values and things like that. Because it's a way that we look at like the ghetto. Right, we look at the ghetto as this place like devoid of value where like moral code just came to die, right? And I don't think that that's the case. I think there's a lot of particularly Aristotelian virtues that you find espoused in like T.I. You don't even have to look at like NWA, right? You can just look at people like T.I. And there's a lot of character virtues that you see there that I like to bring out. So that would be sort of another work to do. Yes, really fast. We got to go.
Can you close by giving just a little brief thing on Locke and econ? Just tell us what exactly, just 30 seconds.
No. So it's not Locke and econ, it's econ philosophy. So I'm interested in the econ conception of personhood. You don't have sort of this very individualistic sense of it. You have personhood as an achievement, right? Personhood is something now that's not personhood sort of like you're to be discriminated against if, you don't achieve this thing. Right, there's sort of a base level of recognition or a base level of respect as a human being that you deserve. But I'm interested in how community participates in our conceptualizations of ourselves. So my interest in the econ concept, quasi-Ruredu's econ conception of the self, insofar as I'm interested in the communality of one's conception of it. All right, good? Yeah, I can wrap up. All right.
Our last presenter will have questions after our last presenter. That's the Serequeberhan.
White at the top.
Okay. All right, what I have for you, I'm sorry to say, is nothing really organized because I will not think to do it. So I'm going to speak off the top of my head about the things that I'm working on right now. I just finished recently a book entitled Existence and Heritage, and I'm happy to see that people are interested in that. If you have questions on that, I'll take it up. I'll take them up later. Right now, I'd like to share with you the idea that I'm working on under the title Thinking the Present. Right? And what I mean by thinking the present, in a way, the book I'm working on now is a continuation of an expansion of further enlargement of stuff that I could not put in here under this title.
thinking the present for me is a way of saying, what then is our post-colonial situation, right? And the way I go about it is the following. If you look at the world we live in, it's a world constructed out of imperial conquest, right? Imperial conquest in every respect. Now, the middle of the last century, 1950s, sort of brings to an end Europe's colonial empire. But by the time the empires are finished, the globe is Europeanized. Basically, it has been imaged in the image of Europe, right? And what has remained are the borders, the colonialism has left, but the presuppositions, the prejudices, right, that run the colonial order are still with us. So what you have is the Europeans have left, but replicas of Europe still persist, right? So what then does that do with our post-colonial situation now? What then does that mean for the present, thinking the present, right? So what I do is, in this book that I'm trying to work on, the first and major chapter would be a chapter on Hegel's philosophy of right. Why the philosophy of right? Because Hegel's work, those of you who know it, the philosophy of right has to do with the idea of objective spirit, right? Spirit has objectified in the world through human history, right? And the way, Hegel thinks about it, I've done some work on Hegel's and colonialism, but now, if you look at the literature that's coming out, for example, I happen to have looked at the catalog that SUNY Press puts out on Hegel last year or so, and there are at least 20 books on Hegel, right? Not one of them talks about colonialism, right? And yet, you cannot legitimately talk about Hegel's philosophy of right without dealing with colonialism. And why? Because for him, it's a cornerstone, right? And for Hegel, being a dialectical thinker, each moment is part of the whole. Now, if you don't have that moment, then the whole collapses, okay? Now, what is colonialism? Hegel thinks of the idea of modern European society as the actualization of freedom, right? That is the great legitimacy. That is what gives legitimacy to Europe globalizing itself. Freedom has been, what is freedom? The subjective individual, the subjective and the objective, the individual, the particular and the universal coming together, right? So the universal, the particular out of its own accord, dovetails with or comes together with the universal, right? Now, for Hegel, this happens through his category, that is something that he invented, civil society, right? That's something modern, right? Civil society says the particular in the pursuit of its own individual interests ends up buttressing or supporting or melting into the universe. How does that happen? Property. What does that mean? It means that, it says the basic principle of abstract right is be a person and respect others as persons, right? How do I respect others as persons? Property. So I have property, you have property, and we each respect each other as property. And this establishes I become a concrete person, right? Now, through the interplay of this relationship of wills that are embodied in property, right? What happens is, it says, situation develops whereby property and wealth are created simultaneously, right? Now I don't remember, and I can't go through every detail of the discussion, but for people who are interested, I have a chapter in my book, Contested Memory, on that, and also there's a paper I did a while back, the idea of colonialism, Hegel's philosophy of right? So, in the interplay of the subjective wills that respect each other as property holders, you have the development of property and wealth at opposite extremes. And Hegel, the very honest thinker, says there is no solution for this. There is none, except that we export the surplus population. Because what he says is you have the simultaneous production of wealth and misery. Paupers, people who have nothing and lose respect for themselves and others, right? And so cannot respect. Then what do? You export them, right? I think if you look at the literature, for example, you find that there's a way in which practical colonialists also thought like that. For example, Cecil Rhodes, right? Literally says that, That's the question of imperialism, the question of bread and butter, right? We have to, otherwise we'll have civil war, right? So these people are exported, and for Hegel, what's interesting is the exporting of these people is like killing two birds with one stone. One, you solve the problem of civil society, and then spirit gets globalized. The savages get civilized, right? What actually happens is civil society exports its problems that are replicated in the colonies, right? Replicated in the colonies, and instead of solving the problem of Europe, the problem of Europe becomes global problem. Now, what does that mean in terms of thinking the present? Think of what's happening today in Europe, the West, right? For that matter, in this country, right? From Latin America, refugees coming, right? Europe, Africans, Asians, Pakistanis, right? What are they doing? They're feeding the sharks of the Mediterranean, the Mediterranean boat. These people are coming to Europe. Why? Because the problems of Europe exported abroad have become global problems, right? So my question is, how do we deal with that? Okay? How do we deal with that? So thinking the present would be just that, to think through the possibility of overcoming this. Right? Now, for me, my areas of expertise are African philosophy and continental European philosophy. For me, this is the question of African philosophy, no other. Why? Because I've been criticized for this, but I won't accept the criticism. But I'm glad that people notice this. That I'm a one-issue philosopher, full enough, because that is the question of Africa. African art, African traditions, African mythology. All that for me is just sugar coating, right? Africa is a continent that's bleeding from every pore. Why? Because the politics of the continent are such that people miss the colonial days when at least they were able to exist, right? How does one solve this, right? So thinking the present for me is engaging that issue, right? Because what we have today as independence is the residue of the colonial past, right? And so I see a kind of, between African philosophy and European continental philosophy, I see an intercrossing. How the critique of metaphysics that begins with Nietzsche and Heidegger, for example, is a critique of this philosophy, right, that has ended up with the technological domination of the world. Simultaneous with that, the thinking, the very way in which African philosophy institutes itself, is they were critiquing the domination that Europe imposed on, right? So there's a way in which African philosophy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the critique of metaphysics as initiated by Nietzsche and Heidegger, right? And for example, more recently, you can talk of Vattimo, Gianni Vattimo, that there's a sort of coming together that we need to sort of develop further, explore further, right? And in doing that, then African philosophy, instead of being this esoteric, isolated little thing, becomes something that is engaged with questions of the present, questions of the here and now. Sorry to say, I don't have much else to add to what I've said, because I don't have anything prepared. I didn't think it was necessary. I was told it was not necessary. But there are questions, I'll be happy to take them, especially because people have read this book, and if they have questions, I'll be more than happy to engage them. Thank you.
Saber, Weber, and Franco, especially your work on one-time agency is valuable. My question, Martin, Berber, and Daniel, especially and Rivers and Johnson, your work on Locke and Curry is definitely valuable for both Sinai and Barnes. So I'm going to leave the floor open for the time being to engage our speakers and ask them more about their projects or relevant questions to your various projects. And if you don't, then you're going to eat your fish, and then you're going to fry a cat, and then you're going to eat your fish again. Thank you.
What you're saying about Hegel, we really know this kind of about the issues that the kind of imperial attitudes have been left over from passion reasons. Would you say that part of, because you mentioned Heidegger, I know one of Heidegger's big critiques about technology is the way it seems to be damping up consumerism. Would you say that maybe part of, like, maybe a better way to structuralize or to help patch up the bleeding areas in Africa would be to set up a new structure more towards, I guess, social programs or social policies?
No, see, the thing is this. Hegel talks about colonialism, and that is one of the first who talks about, for example, that robots are going to take. Technology itself is a problem because it displaces human labor, right? And it creates paupers and immiserated people, right? Heidegger talks about technology as inframing, Gestalt, right? It's inframed and colonized the lived existence, right? Now, for me, the question with Africa is that there's a way in which ending colonialism is not merely expelling what's called the white man, right? It's reclaiming ourselves. See, what's interesting is this. When you look at somebody like, for example, Fanon or Cabral, told that colonialism was the interruption of history, especially Fanon, especially Cabral. That when colonialism came, as you know, it interrupted, we're speaking now against Marxists, right? Because Marxists believe that colonialism sort of civilizes, they're part of the Enlightenment, part of Hegel, right? And Cabral is saying, no, it interrupted our history. What we have to do is to reclaim our history. Now, to reclaim our history is not enough to expel the foreigner. Once the foreigner has been expelled, then the history that has been interrupted, and that's the challenge, has to be reclaimed, right? Now, how is it, what do I mean by reclaiming? If you look at any part of Africa, okay, you find that there are traditional ways of cooking, of child raising, of government, administration, right? Not just dance and music, right? There are methods in which Africans ruled themselves. Right? Many of these methods, furthermore, were democratic methods, right? They were village assemblies. How do we reclaim these in the context of the modern world, right? This is giving the lie to the fact that in academia, for example, I love them, but they did not invent democracy, okay? The demos, the village ruled itself through its elders, to establishing consensus. How do we reclaim this? Because in Africa, what we have, instead of reclaiming this, the foreigner is kicked out, and then we replicate his dictatorship. We replicate his becoming rich. We replicate his exploitation, right? That's the challenge African philosophy has to engage, right? An African philosophy, in my view, an African philosophy that talks about mythology, religion, culture, music. It just, makes for nice curricular developments for American universities and students. Other than that, it serves no purpose. Huh?
It doesn't get much done.
It doesn't do anything. Because what we need is, in Africa, we need to think the possibility of being free. We're not free. Right? And what's interesting is this. I was recently, for some other course, looking at a book by Baldwin. James Baldwin was a fantastic writer, right? In The Fire Next Time, in just one paragraph, it just says, independence means nothing, and integration likewise, because the black man is not free here, and the European has not left Africa. And that's what I'm saying. We have, what has happened is, physically, the European has left, but he's within. You have, Fanon, black skin, white, what's the title? Black skin, white masks, right? Whereas, Semben Osman's film Hala, for example, right? Where you have Africans that are basically white, Europeans, colonialists, not even white, colonialists, right? In black skin, right? Now, that is what independence is right now. And what's interesting, what is sad, not interesting, but what is sad is that it continues to happen. The most recently independent countries in Africa, South Africa, I will not say anything because somebody from there, right? But Eritrea, for example, right? Replication. What we have in Eritrea, we expelled the foreigner after 30 years of struggle. Struggle that was undertaken with local means, right? We had fantastic things there. We had an army of 200-some thousand people, right? 50,000 women fighters, right? What we have now, the women are back in the kitchen, right? Back in the kitchen, right? The population is oppressed. We have a clique that rules as if it knows the truth, right? The way the foreigner rule, right? There's no democracy. What you have thousands of Eritreans living every day, right? So, yeah, the foreigner has been kicked out, but you're not independent. An African philosophy. That's why it is necessarily political philosophy. It has to be. Otherwise, you know, and the reason I say that is because philosophy does not just ask questions. The questions of philosophy are questions that are pressing. In other words, Socrates did not just talk about values because he just liked to talk about values. No, they had collapsed. People did not know what courage meant or what justice meant, hence he had to explore them. The same with us. What does it mean to be independent? Nobody knows.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Do you want to go? Go ahead.
Quick question. So, I mean, I'm not up on my Shakespeare, but like, was the Tempest the one with Caliban?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the end of that play, Caliban says something like really interesting.
Become like hospital. I don't know.
Right? He said,
Yeah.
yeah, he says, "Curse the day you learnt me your language."
Yeah.
Right? Like he falls in love with the king's wife. The king's
Yeah.
like, hell no,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and then Caliban like realizes like that he's not able to be equal to this guy, right? But he realizes something else. He realizes that he's internalized like his inability to be equal to this guy, right? And at the very end, he says, "Curse the day you learnt me your language," right? Applying that to like,
I just thought of it, I don't know right, but
Can I
Yeah.
jump in? Yeah. I think, I mean, if that's all right, yes, is it okay? if I
Go,
just-
please.
Okay, so what's your name?
Drew
Drew, okay. I think that I'm going to use the word roughly, the anatomy of usurpation, coloniality and oppression makes the whole question of how the oppressed, or the black person in this case, sees herself or sees himself, and sees himself being seen, which is the Gaussian question, is much more complex than I think, which, you know, it brings us to, it's a nice question of imitation or replica. I think it's no surprise that we, in phenomenology of mind, we see different ways in which, if we unpack consciousness and self-consciousness first and foremost, which is a kind of a biographical notion, right? To come to consciousness means one is to come to self-consciousness first. So there are a couple of things I want to say. First of all, I think it's no surprise that black consciousness ideologists, Biko included, would tackle Hegel in that way, right? And then, of course, Hegel is then tackled by people like Jacques Lacan, who takes up Freud's later quest of trying to develop an understanding of the unconscious. This is what I want to say. I think that notions of desire, recognition, are far deeper, possibly, than we could ever give an account for. I think it's also complex to be born in a setting and then live away, which I have, which Sinai has as well, because I think there's no way that we could possibly come to terms fully as to what we credit our black consciousness to. Because I don't think it's only about the replica. I think it's about the deep-seated ways in which the enslaved, the black person, has to see himself. And the question of the how, the question of desire, the question of recognition is way, way deeper than I think we could ever grapple with. I mean, I think I see this in South Africa now, you know, a kind of an Americanization of the culture, which is complex in the sense because, you know, there's a quest to come to 1968, this important moment, 1967, 1968, vis-a-vis the Black Panthers, vis-a-vis the fact that we didn't have television in South Africa for black people at that time. So there's a desire to see how other black people live, to have a particular kind of politicized identity that gives dignity, because it is about having to come to terms with desire, with love, with the sense of what does the white man see when the white man looks at the enslaved, and what does the enslaved see beyond the eyes of the white man. So I'm not sure, I don't think it's only about the replica. I think it has to do with deeper notions of how do we recognize ourselves beyond being enslaved, and how do we recognize and see what I'm saying in terms of like an anatomy of oppression. And I think there's a moment in the Isaac Julian film where Stuart Hall tries to paraphrase Frantz Fanon, where he says, in that moment when the little child with his mother says, "Mama, there's the black man," and Fanon has to, in some way, unpack the fact that he had seen himself very much as part of a French community. And that moment where desire and the gaze becomes much more than racism simply being about the denunciation of the black person who's human, but also has to take into account notions of desire, clearly, that is about about sexual desire, about wanting to desire the other. So I mean, I don't know, I think this is a longer conversation, which I could never do credit to in 2 minutes. I'm just saying, I think we need to think harder than whether it's simply just about replica, but whether we have deep-seated notions of the impossibility of being that requires for us somehow to draw in our colonizer. About last year, I taught a gender studies class, second year class, and what I found very interesting was, we have this discussion now in South Africa on decolonizing the curriculum, and we teach Zulu now at our university, which is in KwaZulu-Natal. And so in the class, you usually have your EFE people, you have your ANC people, you have your South African Communist Party, you have the Young Lions from Black Land First, BLF. And so the discussion was about gender and sexuality, and then, I asked this question, in which language do you make love? And of course, for 23-year-olds and 24-year-olds, this is now a time to laugh and joke and whatever. Then one of the students, who also happens to be a drama student, came up and he said, "Oh, can I have the platform?" And I said, "Sure." And he did this whole erotic display of how to seduce a woman in English. And everybody thought it was fantastic. They were like, "Oh, yes, yes, yes." And the minute he did it in Zulu, the women were under the desk and said, "Oh, stop! It's vulgar, it's vulgar." And so we have to ask questions about the possibility of loving yourself in your own language, let alone desiring yourself in your own language. I mean, I think for me, this is a serious question. I'm not saying this for frivolity at all, although I am frivolous, but I'm not saying it for frivolity at the moment. I'm saying this as a serious question of how do black people who've been colonized through the English language, how do Zulu people whose culture it is not to talk about sex and sexuality in the public sphere because it is considered a language of intimacy between two people. And now, 342 years later, now Zulu young people are talking about sex and sexuality but cannot go the Zulu route because that development did not take place in the same way in which the English language developed.
Yeah, I think that also mirrors parenting, because my daughter is 11, she's bicultural, and when I engage with people who speak French, who are from Ivory Coast, where her father is from, and I talk to them about how I parent her and tell her the real names of body parts.
Yeah.
When I teach her to use the word vagina, they say, "Do not teach her that word, it is vulgar." I said, "But that is what it's called."
In
And they
English,
say no,
it's
in
what it's
English,
called in
right,
English.
but they
Yeah.
say no, call it cuckoo.
Yeah,
I am not telling my daughter to call her vagina a cuckoo when the
Okay.
name of it is vagina, but that I don't speak French. I only
Okay.
know English.
yeah, we say cooking.
Right, right, but to me,
Yeah.
that's a colloquialism,
Yeah,
like we got the P word, right?
Yeah.
Instead of saying the proper name
Yeah.
for things, right? So I'm just recognizing it crosses into
Mhm.
self-identity. Like, how do you raise your daughter to love herself if she can't even use the words that we call things,
Yeah.
without it being a taboo to use the words we call things? It's
Yeah.
just, yeah.
I don't know, this is a bigger debate, and I don't necessarily want this discussion to be about sex and sexuality. It's always a lot more interesting. For example, in my culture, right, in the kind of Cape Town culture, I also do a workshop called Writing Memory, Writing the Body. So students, like a small percentage of students wrote the word clitoris. And in my culture, we don't say that word, right? Because that's an English medical word. We say Dela, D-E-L-A. And it means your clitoris, your labia minora, your labia majora. It means all of those because historically, you know the story of Sarah Baartman, and it also is about taking pleasure and pride in your genitals or genitalia that, you know, historically and with stereotypes have been considered for black enslaved women as larger, but using a word that you understand as part of your culture and part of your history. So if I go to my community, I would never use English words because it means like somebody else has ownership of how you call your body. So it's a very complex situation to decolonize your body. Sorry, you've had your hand up for quite a while.
Right, yeah, I was getting a little agitated because he's been interrupted. But, I guess I wanted to originally go to you about this, community aspect of peace. But going on with this language, because now I have any questions, going on with this whole language thing, even, that made me think about, I guess non-sexual terms like the word nigga, using these understood words within the community people. But I'm gonna go back to this community piece. So under this term you use, the Boysian perspective, which is like the awareness and self-consciousness, of ourselves. At what point do, or when will we start recognizing that, I guess, is also applicable to the oppressor, because are now, like, white people seeing themselves as, because they've been getting this feedback, they've been hearing these things, in media, of them being colonizers or them being intrusive in or certain ways, are we now placing this Du Boisian perspective on them to where they have this double consciousness of how they are being viewed in even coming off themselves to a different complexion than theirs. So when you say community of peace, like, what does that look like, or how do you develop that when it's different levels of identities, even within ones that could be identified as commonalities, if I'm making sense. So what does this community of peace essentially mean?
Right, so I take your question to be something like, what is the community of peace in relationship to identity?
Yeah.
Right. It's a reason that attracted me, or it's something that attracted me to Alain Locke, right? We can't have, I know the basis of it is we can't have a uniformitarian understanding of identity or understanding of culture. In other words, we can't promote the view that one culture or one way is the world, right? So when we talk about black culture, we talk about white culture, we talk about this, we talk about that. If those things do in fact exist, we would have to allow not only for the plurality of those things, right? Sort of a black culture that is not committed to like reading, you know, Amiri Baraka over, you know, maybe John or something like that, right? We would have to also talk about like, you know, like a black culture that doesn't privilege being sort of black over being a woman, right? A black culture wherein, you know, black feminists can thrive, right? So it would take sort of those types of identities. I don't subscribe to the view that identity needs to cease, which was sort of one of the more original ideas of cosmopolitanism, right? I'm a citizen of the world. I'm not like Greek. I'm not like, you know, this, I'm not that. I don't define myself as male. I don't define myself as this. I don't think that works, like Alain Locke. You know, that's A, not gonna work. B, I don't think that's beneficial, right? I think all of the things that you have to give up, all of not only the identity types, all of the cultural aspects that you would have to give up to make that work. So we can't abolish identity. We can't unify identity such that we're all just kind of considered to be the same thing. We would have to respect we would have to respect others in difference and hold those identities as sort of one way of holding particular identities that relate to the same concept. So there are different ways to be black, and one must not only be black. To the question of like white people and double consciousness, I'm not sure that I would say that sort of the sort of like talking about colonialism or talking about like racial oppression ought to lead to like double consciousness. Now I do agree with someone like perhaps Adrian Piper gave this advice when talking about race. She said two things. One, connect it to other issues. Two, it has to be done with care. Nobody wants to go into a conference or nobody wants to go into a conversation with you and leave with a black eye, right? So like if your portrayal of history leads you to like blacken the eyes of the person you're supposed to be talking to or the person you're supposed to be convincing that like their identity is, or the way that they're identifying is in some sense harmful, maybe like you failed, at least practically, just as much as like that identity failed you, right? I think sort of promoting the respect, and that's not to suggest that people like ought to be like super polite and, you know, I think your views are pressing me here, right? Like I mean, I think you have to like, you know, say certain things, right? And certain things must be said in certain ways. That's not to deny that, but like I think if done with care, I would just at least be skeptical of like calling certain things oppressive or talking about like the historical reality of colonization should lead to double consciousness.
Okay. All right. Then we have the last question, and then we'll end the session. It's linked, you know, our classes together in critical race theory and philosophy. Do you think that modern technology makes it possible for us to have a language of liberation? Like the language question of can you own your own body in this language? Can you see yourself being racially beyond? Can you create a new Africa out of the old Africa? Does modern technology, is that beneficial to that project or harmful to it? What is that role? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, as you were asking the question, and I was thinking, how am I going to respond, right? This was, I think it's something titled Identity and Dignity in the Context of National Liberation by Alain, right? So he talks about, you know, what this African revolution means, and talks about the fact that, for example, now there's a lot in African cultures that, in my view at least, is rather, you know, very, very uninteresting to say the least, right? The oppression of women, differences in hierarchy of clans and slaves and genital mutilation and all the rest, right? On the other hand, there's also a lot of things in Western culture that are extremely interesting, right? If in Africa, for example, I was saying earlier, in Eritrea we have 50,000 women under arms, right? Fighters. And women's liberation is an idea that comes from the European experience, right? And the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the idea of liberty, all these things are not to be discarded, right? They are to be appropriated. But appropriating them through a synthesis, right? In other words, there's a way in which traditional African conceptions and Western ideas, right? In this process of trying to put them together, right? Then you have a process of appropriating, you know, and sifting out, right? Getting rid of some, you know, and here earlier I was talking about, for example, I was saying that African philosophy and continental philosophy, right? For example, the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer, right? Truth and method, hermeneutics, right? Hermeneutics is just that, right? It's just that. And you know, what's interesting is, look at somebody like Douglas, Frederick Douglass, right? That's how I said, you know, we have to do with the past only as it's useful for the present and the future, right? Meaning, you know, the idea of, you know, that every aspect of African culture is, no, it's not to be. In fact, some stuff is, the sooner we get rid of it, the better, right? But to do so in terms of engaging the problems of the present, right? And so, you are, in this respect, technology, yes, it's very interesting, right? Especially because Europe colonized the world, but before it does that, it first masters nature, right? And we need to master nature. There's a Baldwin points out somewhere, there's in one respect, you know, European culture is superior. It dominated nature. We were not able to dominate. We have to be able to appropriate that. And this is something that you find in African literature, for example, Ambiguous Adventure, right? Ambiguous Adventure, right? The most interesting character in that novel, her name is the Nostra Lady, right? She says, we have to send our children, right? To learn from the foreign school, they have to die in us, so that we can learn how these people can conquer without being in the right? So in this sense, yeah, modern technology, but we have to be able to appropriate it, right? And appropriating it, make it our own, and we make it our own by inventing, right? And I'll share with you one little story. It's a frivolous story, but it's interesting. I went to Eritrea in 1988 when the war was going on. I went there to do a little research, right? And in the liberated zones of Eritrea at the time, 3/4 of the country was free, right? At a certain time, we had electricity at night, right? And it went off at a certain other time. And I remember the lights going on, and I looked around, and there were no switches, you know. And I said, you know, how do you turn them on? So this fighter laughs at me. So I can't you see, where are the switches? And what they had was, they had syringes, you know, syringes, you know. And I was, because there's the liberation war, there's a hospital, people get wounded, you use and you throw them out. So instead of throwing them out, what they had done was, in a syringe, you push it in, right? So they had connected two wires, right? You push it in, the light goes on, you pull it out, the light goes on. There are things hanging, you know. Now, what is that? Well, that's not inventing, but it is inventing something, right? It's making out of trash something, right? We have to be able to do that with modern technology. We have to be able to create it ourselves, right? When we do that, then we'll be at the beginning of freedom. I'm sorry, I'm not emotional, but that's what I have to say.
Man, I don't know, right? I mean, just looking at things like the internet, Facebook, Twitter, and that kind of stuff. I mean, I think there's a sense in which technology does allow us to become closer, right? We can share a picture with billions, right? On the one hand, but then on the other hand, we all have Facebook friends, and we don't even know these people, right? So in a sense, right? In a sense, modern technology, it seems, has the potential of bringing us together, then there's a sense in which, just for my cosmopolitan needs, it does bring us apart if we look in terms of like communication and things like that. I mean, you know, I have 200-300 Facebook friends, and yet I don't even know my neighbor's name, right? And it's funny because like one time, like I'm walking, you know, I'm about to go, and I don't know, I was about to go somewhere, and my neighbor's walking out the door, and like I just kept the door closed until he left, right? Like, you know, like it's funny. I try to avoid my neighbors now, and yet I have 200 Facebook friends, right? So there's a sense in which technology has this capability. I mean, look what it does as far as like allowing us to view, and I don't know what's changing, but allowing us to view certain injustices like police shootings and stuff like that. Like now we're capturing a lot more police shootings and things like that on cell phones, right? And it has this, again, it has this potential. My brother's in Japan right now, you know, I can FaceTime my brother, right? It has these marvelous potentials as far as bringing us together. And yet, it doesn't, at least, there is sort of room. I don't want to universalize my own life or universalize sort of how I'm using technology, but it does have the capacity to kind of, I guess, keep us apart insofar as people just mean less to us, right? Interactions with people just mean less to us. Like I don't know.
I don't have to respond if people like to go.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Okay. I want to thank our guests. I spent some time with them right after this session. And you know, my graduate students were graduate students interested. We did that mushroom at 6 o'clock. Pizza's free. Thank you again.